Okay.
review.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is the blonde blogger Maxwell Ivy, and today on What's Your Excuse, I'm going to be talking with John Lee Dumos, and I'm just going to get right to it. JLD, um, from the outside looking in, it appears to me and might appear to other people that you have not really struggled with a lot in your life, and the more I've gotten to know you, the more I've realized how wrong that is. But I'm just wondering if you could share a time in your life when you suffered some real adversity, what it was, and how you dealt with it.
I can definitely understand and hear where you're coming from on that, because I will say I do seem to, thus far, knock on wood, led a pretty blessed and fortunate and lucky entrepreneurial life. Like, my entrepreneurial ventures have seemed to work out for the most part. I've definitely had my share of failures, but they've been small. I've been able to mitigate the downside. My successes, I've been able to maximize the upside. So definitely agree with you on that point, that most of the things I've done in the entrepreneurial world since 2012, which is when I started, have worked out pretty well. Again, I have a long road ahead of me, a ton of failures, and I'm sure a couple of disasters ahead of me. But for the time being, so far, so good. To go back to a real struggle, which you potentially may or may not be referring to, was, the time that I was an officer in the U.S. Army. I mean, there I was, 23 years old, just a year out of college, and like the most fun 4-year cycle of my life, with almost zero responsibility. Now I'm in Iraq, in charge of 16 men, getting shot at almost on a daily basis, having to face death, losing 4 of my soldiers that I was tasked to bring home safely to their family, to their loved ones, and having to deal with that for the rest of my life, having to deal with the fact that soldiers that I was in charge of are now no longer walking this earth, potentially because of decisions that I made that day that led up to that situation where they were killed. And that's a struggle for anybody at any age. For me at 23 years old, I still hadn't, lived a super long and experienced life. So it was quite a shock to my system. I definitely, from the ages of 23 until really my late 20s, dealt with multiple forms of PTSD and not really even knowing how to correctly deal with that. So, I would say on a grand business entrepreneurial scheme of things, I have been able to adjust post that into my early 30s when I launched Entrepreneurs on Fire at 32 years old. And for the past 8 years, I've had a pretty remarkable run in the business field. But my 20s were tough. My 20s were in war, experiencing death, experiencing responsibility for some of those deaths, and knowing that I will be living with that on my shoulders for the rest of my life. And not to mention, as I said, going through real trauma, real PTSD, and unfortunately not getting the correct treatment for that for a long time. So that would kind of be what I point to for my biggest struggle.
Right. And do you still have times today where you have to struggle with the memories and the experiences that you went through when you were only a 20-something-year-old kid, let's say?
Absolutely. That's never going to leave. I had to realize that pretty early on. That was kind of one of my bigger things to come to grips with, was that there's always going to be those flashbacks. There's always going to be those moments. There's always going to be that trauma. But at the end of the day, I just need to say, live in the present moment, and let me now do everything I can to impact this world in a positive way. Not that I impacted the world in a negative way back then, but just the fact that I do and always will kind of have some semblance of guilt and struggle from what happened while I was at war.
And you said you were improperly treated, but when you did start dealing with the effects of that, did you learn techniques from that have helped you now that you've become an entrepreneur?
Absolutely. One thing that I really struggled with was just kind of being alone by myself with my own thoughts, because they seem to always kind of go in the wrong direction. And that's one thing that my treatment really helped me with, was learning how to meditate, learning how to journal, to get my thoughts out of my head onto paper. And those are 2 things that I now have as part of my daily morning routine that are a big part of my ongoing success and battle, against ongoing PTSD, which again, I truly do feel like I don't experience on a high level any longer, but there is always that low underlying tone that's going to be there.
Right. Okay. And then I listened to a little bit about how you started your first podcast and how you've had the feelings that you had done everything right, but for some reason you weren't successful, and you were struggling with the fact that I should be doing better than I am because I did everything right.
Yeah, that was just my misconception because, you know, in certain things in life, like as an officer in the Army or taking tests in school, like you study hard, you get all the answers right, you get good grades and like you do well. But that's not always the case in entrepreneurship. And in fact, sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you can do everything right. And just for reasons outside of your control, like a lot of us are experiencing right now in this world, you're going to fail. You're going to struggle. You're going to have obstacles and challenges. And it's not always fair and it's not always right. And there's not always an explanation for it. Sometimes it just happens that way. And that was something I had to come to grips with because, you know, I had led a very traditional life up to 32 years old. You know, grew up in Maine, went to high school, went to college on an Army scholarship, spent 4 years as an active duty officer, went to law school, corporate finance, commercial real estate, like bang, bang, bang. And then all of a sudden I was 32 and I'm like, I'm just going to try this entrepreneurship thing where there's really no rules and there's really like no sense of certain things. They just happen for specific reasons that you may or may not find out in the future. And that's entrepreneurship. And that's the road that I chose. And for better or for worse, here I am.
Yeah. Now, today, when I told people I was going to be interviewing you and I asked for their support, they told me what a regular person you are, what a great guy you are, how much you give of your time.
Cool.
Yes. And one person, Kim O'Neill, said, Max, you should ask him, why does he feel it's important to share his message or experiences on your podcast, the What's Your Excuse show?
So honestly, like I'm just a big believer in being honest and being open and being transparent and being genuine. Those are my goals. That's why it's very, you know, heartwarming and nice to hear that other people are perceiving me that way as well, because that is an honest goal of mine. Like I really want that to be the case. And I'm going to continue to strive for that to be the case, to be frank. Like that's a huge goal of mine. And so, you know, seeing what you're doing with your show about really bringing out that open, honest transparency, even when it comes to talking about the hard subjects, because a lot of people, for understandable reasons, want to avoid the tough subjects, want to avoid the struggles and the obstacles and the challenges. And so I like how you tackle that head on. And it just, to me, made a lot of sense to come on and have a nice conversation with you about it.
Right. And I should admit to people that I kind of stuck my foot in my mouth. And the first few times I exchanged messages with John Lee, but thankfully he's forgiven me for that. And I'm really happy that you've come on and shared as openly as you have so far.
Well, I think you shouldn't leave your listeners hanging. What are you referring to specifically?
Yeah, I basically said, John Lee, you don't look like you've ever had a bad day in your life. And to which he responded, have you ever had a guest on this lost friends in combat? And I had to go, yep, that's what you get when you assume stuff about people you don't really know yet. And unfortunately, online, we tend to think we know people more than we do. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about that since you've called me out on it.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, so that was one thing that made me want to come on your show is because I think it was completely fine for you to assume that because you saw what you saw, you read what you read. Like, you know, that was, you know, your perception and, you know, perception is not always reality. And so I like the fact that you came out and, you know, you said, hey, I think you might not be a fit for my show for these reasons. And I said, well, it actually seems like I'd be a great fit for your show for these reasons. And like, that's why I just love being open, honest, and transparent in different ways that I can, like with our income reports and different things along those lines, even though a lot of people, you know, think it's kind of crazy to do stuff like that. But I'm like, why should we be hiding things? I mean, like, I want to show other people the treasure map if it can help them in any way, shape, and form. And like, to me, that's very, very important. But I do think at the end of the day, and excuse my French, but when you do assume, it can make an ass out of you and me. Like that's what assuming is. And, you know, for me, I've made a ton of assumptions over the years that have proven to be true. I've made a ton of assumptions over the years that have proven to be false. And at the end of the day now, I try to approach things by saying, hey, until I actually hear it from the horse's mouth, you know, I'm going to take it with a grain of salt. And that's my attitude. So that's kind of, you know, what I would say to other people that are seeing this or seeing that from others online is like, hey, until you're seeing like a video of them looking you in the camera and saying something specific, like it may or may not be true.
Yep, that is so true. Now you've talked about assumptions you've made and the things people portray online. So, but what would you say is the one thing that you think seems to get in people's way the most as far as them accomplishing a goal, whether that's starting a podcast or some sort of other entrepreneurship or even doing something like getting a college degree or deciding to learn a new hobby or something? What do you think is the one biggest roadblock?
Well, hopefully what stops people from getting a college degree is the fact that they're going to accrue a ton of debt that is not worth it. So hopefully that stops people from getting a college degree. But if we're going to shift over just to the other things you're talking about, it's confidence. It is 100% confidence and the lack thereof. And listen, it's a human trait. We all struggle with confidence around things that we don't know, around things we've never done before, around things that we're not good at, around change. That is a human trait. That's a human quality. So this is the reality. You, and I'm not speaking to you, Max, specifically, I'm speaking to the camera.
I understand.
You probably lack confidence in doing X, Y, or Z, which is why you're not doing those things. And guess what? That is okay, because you are a human being, and I lack confidence in certain things that I've never done and I'm not good at. I lacked confidence launching a podcast, but then when I podcasted for 2,000 days in a row, I grew confident around podcasting. So do the thing you fear the most and fear will disappear. That's a Mark Twain quote. It's a little butchered, but it's essentially, you get the point. And that is so key. Your confidence and your lack of confidence is holding you back. Period. End of story.
Well, I recently was asked to talk about why people, to help people launch podcasts. And I told them that in order to have a good podcast, we have to be bad at it for a while. Thankfully, you weren't bad at it ever. At least,
Not true. I was bad, brother. You're being too kind. I just told a story today, actually, about how I was so nervous podcasting. I was shaking while I was holding the piece of paper where I had written out everything I wanted to say on it. Because unlike you, I didn't have video. I just had audio only. So I could cheat and have this piece of paper. And I'm shaking so bad that my guest said, "John, I can hear the papers rustling." And I was like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. Because I had no confidence. I was not good, but I kept putting in the reps.
Yeah, and at 2,000 episodes later, and who knows how many of the world's greatest entrepreneurs later, here you are, the person and the brand that is an entrepreneur on fire. So I want to thank you for agreeing to sit down with me for a few minutes, and I hope that my audience has learned something. And the one thing I hope that they do that they don't always do is that I get a lot of this, Max, you inspired me. I like to hear, well, what did we inspire you to do? If listening to John Lee Dumos didn't inspire you to take some sort of action, then I'm going to channel a little of JLD here. If it didn't cause you to take some sort of an action, I don't want to hear about it.
Oh, I love it, Max. You listen well, brother. I love it. And thanks for having me on the show. Much appreciated. Keep doing what you do, brother. And I'll catch you on the flip side.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it so much, and you have a good day.
Entrepreneurs on Fire.